This episode of 50 Shades of Planning is brought to you in partnership with Kratos Group. We are a leading communications consultancy, helping some of the UK's best-known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.
Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. In anticipation, viewers, of the revised NPPF, which was published on the 30th of July, so last week as I record this, I invited some of the Shades alumni to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them, and, hopefully you viewers, and how the new government could and should approach them. 8 conversations were recorded, elements of which you might have heard formed part of episode 128 of the podcast, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the first of the 8, which was recorded, as you will hear, about half an hour after the NPPF emerged, and is a conversation between Paul Smith, Andrew Taylor, Shelly, Rouse and Annie Gingell about housing targets. Paul is Managing Director at the Strategic Land Group. Andrew is Group Planning Director at Vistry Group. Shelly is a Principal Consultant at the Planning Advisory Service. And Annie is an Associate Director at Tetlow King. Their conversation takes in the role and value of targets, the merits of a stock-based standard method, and straying somewhat off-piste towards the end, though all the more enjoyable for that, a national scheme of delegation. Enjoy.
So, Sam wanted us to talk about housing targets, and it's obviously been well trailed in the lead up to the election that Labour wants to reintroduce mandatory housing targets as part of their drive to deliver 1.5 million homes over the Parliament. Now, this recording is one of a series of recordings where we've been talking about a variety of different strands of Labour's planning strategy and planning policy reforms. All of those were recorded before the new draft NPPF was made available, and we are recording this about 28 minutes after it was made available. And Sam has therefore asked us to pretend that we haven't read it yet to try and make sure that all of these episodes are coherent. We are going to do our best to pretend that we haven't read it, but if we do inadvertently say something that makes us look like we are absolute oracles for knowing what was going to be included and getting the detail absolutely bang on, like for instance the precise amount by which some of these housing targets increased, that is why. So please do forgive us for that. I suppose the place to start, and Andrew, I suspect you will have a strong view on this, is, why do we need mandatory housing targets in the first place? Why is it something that Labour's looking at?
So mandatory housing targets, setting that threshold for all local authorities across the country. Housing is a national priority, so setting that at a national level and having a clear methodology by which everybody starts from is key. And that's what delivers more housing. Basically, what we've seen over the last few years is the removal of those mandatory targets, the dramatic fall off in planning applications being submitted and approved, and surprise, surprise, a rapid drop off of houses actually being constructed and built. And I think the clarity of a national mandatory target, yes, as a starting point, because some areas may need to move their need to adjacent areas, etc., for different reasons. But that clear starting point, so you don't have any of that argument and discussion at a local plan examination or in the evidence base leading up to it, just makes the whole situation clear, obvious to people, and if as trailed, wink, wink, if as trailed in the manifesto and in the discussion, we move to a much more sensible, up-to-date approach to targets and the methodology, all the better.
Yeah, I think from a local authority perspective, that stability and certainty that having some form of kind of mathematical starting point is a bit of a game changer from the old system of OAN. It helps kind of councils be really clear with their communities, with their members about where, you know, what the need is, where the starting point is. But yeah, I think I welcome a lot of the things that are trailed, in that it will be moving from a mathematical calculation that uses some quite out-of-date data sets, which in some parts of the country don't really bear any kind of correlation to the reality of housing need within particular areas, and that's numbers up and down. The standard method does some weird things in some unusual places. And if as trailed, it is moving to a kind of stock-based approach. So taking the number of homes within an area and kind of saying, well, there's going to be in a kind of incremental, you know, percentage increase, and that's going to be the starting point. I think that makes that conversation with communities a lot easier, because it's like, well, these are existing homes. It's existing kind of population growth from your existing communities, from your existing residents. It's just, you know, people kind of grow from an area outwards and outwards. So it sort of demystifies some of the migration trend issues that get baked in, or some of the kind of, you know, I suppose them and us narrative around population statistics that gets generated around the standard method. So I think it's a much more tangible link between existing places, existing communities, and existing housing need, and it provides that kind of certainty and stability. Because it won't, I think it won't kind of change on a rolling basis of population statistics kind of jump forward every year in terms of a 10-year kind of annualized period, but also the affordability ratios then jump forward on a different time set. So things changed at different points in the year in terms of how the standard method was calculated. So I think limiting when it changes, and we, you know, we don't know the exact details of the particular data sets that are going to be used and whether that's going to change, but that feels like quite a big game changer for that messaging from councils to communities and their members.
I think it's important to acknowledge, though, no matter how you calculate the standard method figure, and it's really good to have sort of a universal starting point for all local authorities, so we cut out that arguing at EIP about what the number is. It is still divorced from the Para 63, which is the needs of different groups. And that's something that I think needs a bit clear guidance from government as to how those things are calculated. Because at the moment, whether it's self-build, affordable housing, care, there's no real standard way of calculating those needs. And because you're still doing sort of the old world version of calculating those figures, they don't line up with the standard method figures, which then makes it quite hard to get the link between the two and get those delivered. And I think you'd actually be able to get more community buy-in if you could set out what the types of homes are going to be and why they're the right homes. And that feeds into this building the homes we need. We need homes, but what kinds of homes? And I think that's the bit that the standard method misses for me at the moment, and possibly with the new one that may or may not be coming.
And it'd be really interesting to see whether the definition of affordable housing changes within Annex 2, the glossary of the NPPF, because that's clearly a big mandate. It's not just housing need, it's around affordable housing need and social housing need, and, you know, the kind of grey belt exceptional circumstances will be very much linked to the delivery of affordable homes.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into the phrase genuinely affordable that's been tossed around quite a lot, but we still haven't got any definition of what genuinely affordable means. And first homes with their caps, they're cheap in some parts of the country, still really expensive in other parts of the country. And then if we think about the sort of social rent side of things, a lot of the time at the moment, affordable rent is preferred because there are massive funding issues. So if we are going to put this focus on social rent, especially on grey belt sites, which are more likely to have viability issues because they are grey belt by nature, where's the funding gap going to be plugged to address that? That's my worry.
I think one of the advantages of this stock-based approach, though, is that it's actually clear and simple. And I think one of the problems that we have as planners trying to get local communities to sort of buy into what's being done, what the planning system is trying to do, is that often things can be so complicated and so difficult to explain that it makes people start, it makes it hard for them to understand the logic and the rationale for what we're doing. And I think to say to somebody, the housing target for your local authority is the same as it is for everywhere in the country. It's to increase your housing stock, the number of homes by, let's pluck a number out of the air, 0.8% per annum. And in some instances, that will be higher if house prices are very expensive compared to local incomes. That's really easy to explain to somebody. And all the other stuff that comes from it, that flows from it in terms of the mix of homes and the precise types of homes, that is important too. But I think the primary question that people normally want to answer, what need to try and understand is where that total figure comes from in the first place. And one of the great things about what Labour have been talking about doing, and this was trailed in the papers earlier in the week, that the standard method is going to dramatically increase the housing target, the baseline housing target for England, if I can call it that. And because the more homes that are being delivered, that means the higher that target becomes, the more that means that you're getting a greater number of sites where planning permission is being granted. That means that you've got a greater number of players in the marketplace, and there will be a much wider range of product delivered as a response to that. Because there will be more space for SME developers and care home developers and specialist affordable housing developers and all these other particular needs. And we can have development management policies that sort of deal with that a little bit. But I think getting that headline number right in the first place is so crucial, because as I have said numerous times on 50 Shades podcasts, we can't dream homes into existence. We can't wish them into existence. We need to plan for it. And this is the first time for a very, very long time where I think we are actually planning to do that, which is great.
Yeah, and I think that's been mined a little bit, because obviously we've had the affordability uplift for a while, but then also we've had this sort of upheaval with the planning system where the standard method hasn't actually been planned for or built out. So I think it's that element where you do get the uplift. So if the new method did actually increase the number of homes quite a lot, then hopefully you would get that sort of affordability come down where there was more supply in the market.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Paul. I think there's a lot of kind of optimism around at the moment. And it would be really interesting, leaning back to your point around that kind of transparency around where the figures were coming for, and having that kind of more transparent conversation, is around the 35% uplift. So working with lots of kind of the core cities group and combined authorities, pretty much everyone who's on the list for a 35% uplift goes, it's really hard because it's a kind of policy on arbitrary figure that's been added to explain like where the rationale for that number comes from. Why not 35%? Well, or 37%? Why not 25%? It was a kind of, randomly picked number. So, spoiler alert, it does disappear in the new version. And actually, I think the housing need for London drops by about 18,000. So I think that will be a kind of welcomed change by many of the kind of cities. I'm working with a lot of local authorities who are constrained city areas, and they're like, actually, we could probably meet our numbers apart from the 35, and the 35% is the kind of amount of need. We've had to talk to our neighbours through duty to cooperate, through kind of sharing numbers across the city region, and it's been really quite difficult for them to search for those opportunities to kind of meet housing needs within some sort of constrained areas. Now, I know actually that compared to other cities in Europe, we've got the lowest kind of density of cities by quite a long margin. But those kind of mass scale increasing of densities of cities is quite difficult to do. And I think it's one of these things that, as we talked about in the strategic planning talk, it's kind of a harder than local nut to crack. So I think the removal of the 35% and actually bit more of a strategic approach to housing need around our kind of cities and, you know, city region areas is probably a better way of solving that problem.
And so I suppose that at that point, Shelley, moving on to how you move that need around, that's quite interesting, because at the moment, the legislation that will deal with some of that isn't here. So we've got dues to cooperate and sort of, you know, underline that that's still there. But what we haven't got is the legislation for strategic planning and things like that. So actually, we've got this funny situation for the next year or two, probably, where local plans or councils are going to have to get back to that duty to cooperate stuff, and perhaps a bit more than that. And you know, working in these areas, and government have talked about devolution and how, well, you know, that complexity starting to overlay before we've actually got that legal structure in place. So you can see, you know, certainly those areas that will want to move some of their need elsewhere. That, you know, that potentially could slow down some of the local plan making or make it slightly more challenging in the next period. Although I think the devolution letter from Secretary of State a week or so ago did talk about, we actually want you to start working now, and we'll work with you informally before the structure. So, you know, trying to put that pressure on to keep things moving.
Yeah, and you know, spoiler alert, that as part of the kind of consultation, there is a magic spreadsheet that shows kind of housing needs. So I've very rapidly crunched the numbers to see which regions and councils get the kind of biggest difference between the existing method and the current method. And you know, the regions are the southeast, the southwest, and the northwest. So actually, it's not going to be many cities that are hit by increases in housing numbers. It's going to be shires, boroughs, and districts that are kind of going to be much more affected by the change to the method and uplift in housing. And all of those regions, you know, it's around a kind of 16 to 17,000 extra homes a year per annum. You know, that's quite a substantive amount when you sort of start spreading it across by authority area.
But it's also interesting, say for the Southwest, for example, a lot of the plans that are coming forward at the moment aren't planning to meet anywhere near what the current standard method is under the current figure calculation. So while on the face of it, from what their calculation is and what it will be, it doesn't look that big of a jump. It's still quite an increase. Actually, in terms of local plans, they're going to have to double, triple what they're looking to plan for. And I think that's going to be quite difficult for some councils to actually pallet, where they've got to Reg 19, they're delivering 1,000 homes a year less than their standard method figure, and suddenly they have to meet that and more, which is going to be interesting to see how that works, because for some councils it will mean having to go back quite a few stages to get these allocations and actually start talking to developers who they've said no to before, and how that's going to work and how local communities are going to react to that, because it will be a significant shift for some councils.
I think that shines a light on a really important aspect of this discussion, really, which is that, you know, the old standard method, as we can call it that now, produced a housing target for the whole of England of about 305,000 homes, something like that. And all the local plans in England, between them, were aiming to deliver something in the order of 240,000 homes. And we don't really know the exact figure because, believe it or not, nobody monitors it, but it's something roughly in that order. So with this new method spitting out a significantly higher figure, is that because the Labour government really genuinely think that much higher number is going to be delivered, and that's how they get to 1.5 million homes over the Parliament, because you're going to do 170, 180,000 this year, so you need to be doing 380, 390, 400 5 years from now? Or is it significantly higher because they expect there will be some slippage from it as plans move through the system and become adopted? And, you know, if you reach for the moon, even if you miss, you end up in the stars, as my dad always says. You know, they can slip from a higher number and still hit 300,000 homes a year. You know, what do we think about that?
I think there probably is some contingency on that. And I think also it's that elephant in the room of, is this going to be achieved in this parliament? Because obviously it takes a while to get through the system. So is there maybe sort of a bit of a political hope that if we set the numbers quite high, there'll be a little bit more of an uptick in completions or starts on site, because it's going to get worse before it gets better? And I mean, we will have the consultation, wink wink, but that's got to be consulted on, that's got to be implemented. We'll have transitional arrangements. So it's going to be a couple of years before local plans are in place that are starting to meet this level of need. So I think there might be an element of kicking it forward.
Well, and the transitional arrangements become really interesting around that as well, don't they? Because, you know, if you were, hypothetically speaking, Newcastle under Lyme Council in Staffordshire, which had a committee, a meeting last week, where they approved their Reg 19 plan for consultation to kick off imminently, and all of a sudden their housing target almost doubles. What does it mean for them? You know, they've been working on that plan for a good number of years, and they're a Greenbelt authority. They're proposing to release a lot of Greenbelt to meet the housing need under the current standard method. What are the implications for authorities like that? And that's a really difficult circle to square, I think, because if you are going to deliver this much larger number of homes under the new standard method, you need every authority to be planning to deliver that higher number. But actually, if you tell authorities like Newcastle on the Line that they've got to stop and start again, then actually you delay them delivering even the lower number of homes by 2, 3, 4 years. And how the government tries to deal with that, I think, is going to be a really, really important part of this.
And I think it comes back to that point: is it better to have a plan that plans for something than have no plan and you're planning by appeal, in essence? Which I don't think there's necessarily a right answer to it, but in the context of a plan-led system, it's probably better to have a plan.
I think this is a key tension, isn't it? It's if you want to deliver 1.5 million, then the biggest correlation between delivery is having a local plan in place. You know, so the identification of land equals land gets built on. You know, it's quite a crude correlation, but definitely there's lots of statistics out there that show if you have a plan, that boosts housing delivery. So it will be really interesting. I really hope that there is some flexibility within the transitional arrangements, and it's the Newcastle under Lyme kind of example. They're allowed to get on and adopt a plan and start an immediate review, because, you know, unless we kind of take that approach, it's going to slip from only a third coverage of local plans to, you know, a quarter to a fifth. So, you know, we've got to start somewhere. And if local authorities have kind of got that far in their plan making, then I would sincerely hope that they'll be allowed to continue rather than sort of have the abortive work, particularly with local authority finances the way they are and the cost of doing a local plan. But, you know, I think the sort of second point I wanted to make is, you know, the key to plan making successfully is having political buy-in, whether that's kind of cross-party or the administration, or kind of even higher up the scale. And I was quite pleased to see in the week that, you know, significant numbers of Labour MPs had written to the Secretary of State to say, we are fully on board with the growth agenda. We will be helping our local authorities, helping our local leaders kind of, you know, get with the programme and achieve this ambition. And I think that's the kind of ethos we've got to capture and start to kind of embed across local authorities, because that's going to be the successful ingredient for successful plan making and successful delivery of 1.5 million homes, is getting everyone on the same page and getting everyone to kind of commit to the growth agenda. Because I think that lack of commitment across the board is probably what triggered the mixed messages and kind of rolling back nuances of mandatory versus advisory that we've had over the last kind of 5 years that's impacted plan making.
Because we're all making the assumption in this discussion, though, that planning for more homes will, you know, actually mean we see more homes built. And if I'm to believe a lot of the people that appear on my social media feeds, you know, we've got 1 million homes with planning permission that haven't been built anyway, and all that's going to happen is Andrew and his colleagues are just going to land bank it and not build out these homes in the first place. Isn't that right, Andrew?
Oh, I hate that word. I hate that word, land banking.
Well, obviously, as a home builder, the thing we want to do is get consent and not actually build any homes. That's the fundamental point of our business model, or perhaps not. We don't. Yes, we are a company, and we exist to build homes and sell them on to owner occupiers, onto housing associations, onto councils, private sector. So yeah, it's always very disappointing when people who should know better trail the same very tired statements in terms of the numbers of permissions that are sitting there. I think it goes back to that need for a higher number of housing to cope with that churn. I think Lichfield's saw about 20% need over and above to make sure that you have the duplicate consents, the timed out ones, the consents that the landowner changes their mind, for example. But yeah, I think you do have that scenario where if we have more consents coming through, or have more allocations, have more consents, we will get more housing delivered. Government are also talking about the need for the affordable housing coming through. So hopefully, thinking about finance and that side, which again drives that delivery of housing in total to come through as part of those new consents. So yeah, one follows the other. I think that's quite clear.
Yeah, and I think related to that as well, it's important that we remember that the housing market in England isn't a national market. It's a series of overlapping local markets. And, whilst the number of homes that are sold on any given site might go up and down from time to time, dependent on market conditions, you can still increase the number of homes that you build overall if you are serving a greater number of those local markets. And Centre for Cities did a research paper years ago that I'm always talking about, called Sleepy Suburbs, that said that half of our suburbs delivered an average of one home a year over the last decade. Those markets are not being served, and by allowing development in more market areas, we will see more homes be built. And Rich Savills did some research for the LPDF that was looking at the number of outlets that major developers were working on, the number of sites they were building on. And that number's declined every year for the last 6 or 7 years, I think. They are serving fewer markets because there are fewer sites available. And if the housing target goes up and you therefore allocate more sites for development through the local plan, and there are therefore more planning permissions being granted, more of those markets are being served, and you will see the number of homes being built increase, regardless of what happens to the sales rates on individual sites. They can go up or down with market conditions, and you'll still build more overall.
Going back to the point about more supportive MPs, I think that's really important. And I'm also hoping, seeing as the Local Government Association is Labour-led, we will have the LGA being much more supportive about the drive. This is, a Labour agenda, a Labour-led Local Government Association. So hopefully things will tie up with those supportive Labour MPs, the supportive Local Government Association and Labour councils across the country. We will need to ensure that all the other political parties are supportive and or are encouraged to be on the same path as the government, because we do need that whole ecosystem to actually work together to deliver. Numbers, don't just deliver by themselves, do they? We need the consents coming through. We need that supportive, both political and officer environment, to enable that to actually be delivered, and those numbers translate into homes constructed.
Yeah, I completely agree, Andrew, and yeah, I really hope that's the signalling that comes out on all fronts. I think linked to that is going to be, we don't yet know what the carrots and sticks are going to be to encourage that type of kind of positive pro growth positioning, particularly in local government rather than sort of MP level. So it's not clear. I haven't got to the bit that reads about it around kind of 5-year housing land supply and the housing delivery test. There have been sort of rumours that the housing delivery test would shift from not homes delivered, but number of consents issued being one of the indicators that kind of councils are held, their performance is held against. We'll wait to see if that actually comes to fruition, or if things like the housing delivery test and 5-year housing land supply are kind of left alone. But definitely incentives for plan making, I think would would be welcome. And we saw a big one in December 2023 come in with, if you have an up-to-date local plan, you're kind of free from having to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply at individual appeal circumstances. Whether that kind of remains, I hope it does. That's a really kind of positive incentive, and we hear a lot from chief executives and political leaders of councils that is a real kind of driving incentive for supporting plan making, both in terms of resources and financial contributions in councils. But yeah, it will definitely need some carrots and sticks to help kind of drive that behaviour across the board.
I think it's going to be interesting to see as well, because obviously we've had the period where we didn't have the duty to cooperate, and some councils have progressed local plans, how that's going to work under the transitional arrangements if you have an authority in a strategic area that has an up-to-date plan under a lower standard method compared to everybody else having to work towards the new figure, and how is that going to work? Because there is a potential for some plans to have been adopted without being able to accommodate unmet need when really they probably should have been. And if that is covered in the new NPPF, which has been coming out.
I think with a lot of this, though, we need to be careful that we don't let perfect become the enemy of the good. And we've been in a really, without trying to be too melodramatic about it, we've been in quite a dark place, haven't we, as a planning and housing industry for the last 12 or 18 months. And I think, that there is a lot of positive stuff here. There's a huge amount of detail to be worked through. But you know what? It doesn't actually matter if we don't get all of that detail right. Because I think there's enough positivity to begin with. There's enough positive signalling to begin with that, we'll still make some big strides, notwithstanding, making what may be perceived as mistakes in some of those things around transitional arrangements and duty to cooperate, and sticks and carrots for local authorities to progress local plans and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think it is that shift in positivity, because I know we've all felt really like something good is happening and something is actually changing. And I think that will feed down to more sort of local level as well, where there is this shift in the wind of actually let's grant things and let's get things built. And unless there's a good reason why you shouldn't build it, then get on with it kind of thing. And we'll hopefully see less of these appeals where it's allocated sites recommended for approval, which is just an absolute waste of taxpayers' money that eventually flow through the inspectorate. So if that, I think it might take a bit of time for those attitudes to change, but if that does shift a little bit more, we might be able to actually get things through at committee or at officers' report, via officers' report, which then feeds into the sort of national scheme of delegation and giving planning officers the credit they're due and helping with the morale and actually making them feel like they're placemaking and can make a difference, not that they're going to have to defend decisions to committee members when they know that this is probably the right choice, and if it did go to appeal they're going to lose it.
I think those short-term planning applications is key for the housing targets as well, isn't it? We know that it's there in terms of delivering for local plans and strategic planning, but actually the reality in the next few years is it's going to have an impact on the speculative applications coming through, and then either applications and or appeals as part of that process. And that's the only way that the government are going to be able to deliver anywhere near to the 1.5 million homes, is that short-term cycle of those applications coming through, and then the homes being delivered, because it's going to take that 2-3 years at least for the local plans to come through and deliver those numbers. And that is a reality of this change of housing number and the impact it has on the other policies and local plans being out of date and terminology in relation to that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's going to be the decision making, the sharp end of the planning system where these numbers are going to kind of have the biggest impact rather than plan making. Because if you want to deliver 1.5 million homes, you've kind of got to be giving consents for them like now or within the next 18 months, for them to have a kind of fighting chance of coming out the ground. Yeah, I've mixed feelings about a national scheme of delegation. I think it will be something that will be incredibly popular with officers and kind of professional side of planning. I think it will be incredibly unpopular with the political side of local authorities. But I think if there are going to be sweeping changes, it's got to come from that national perspective, because it won't happen if everyone's kind of left to kind of squabble about. I mean, I watch an unhealthy amount of planning committees, probably 2 to 3 a week. Which, yeah. So, and they're not even my applications. I don't even have any skin in the game, and I put myself through that. And there are, you know, many circumstances where I query why this application has even come to committee when it could have been a delegated. I then look at the sort of increased officer cost. So for even kind of a single house, the cost of it being determined under delegated, if it has to go to committee, it's 10 times the amount of processing and officer cost and cost to the public purse to make a decision on that particular application. And again, the number of times you see things where it's an allocated site, it's kind of been through the principal setting of having development on this area. But, you know, there are some, it's not quite as perfect. It doesn't quite align with the allocation policy. You know, it maybe says it's 660 homes rather than up to 600, as was written in the policy. And, you know, those kind of overturns or refusals can add like 3 to 4 years onto the kind of development pipeline. And I think that is what this kind of national scheme of delegation, and we don't know any detail, I kind of really hope it sort of limits that sort of second bite of the cherry process that happens, because that's got to be a surefire way of kind of improving delivery.
Yeah, especially when quite often, if it is an allocated site recommended for approval, officers won't defend the appeal. So then you're spending more money on external consultants who actually have no skin in the game in the local area quite often. Or you end up in situations where the councils just don't defend the appeal at all and everybody's talking to themselves. But again, I think it'd be one of those things where as time goes on, that attitude will sort of filter through a little bit more, and it will be a case of, well, there's no point in refusing this for not silly reasons, that sounds a little bit too glib, but trying to make it absolutely perfect. It goes back to what Paul was saying and going, right, well, this does meet the criteria here and here, let's have a conversation. And it actually becomes more about better placemaking, because it probably will get through an appeal based on XYZ, which then takes the reins back almost to local people in a way, I would think, or at least officers in a way where you can have that open dialogue and go, right, we're going to do this, if we do that, and make it more about place and make it more about homes rather than just getting consents on the line.
And it comes back to the conversation that we were having in the larger than local, one of these discussions about, you know, the way that you can actually bring more resource into the planning system isn't just spending more money, it's also freeing up existing officer time. And, you know, a national scheme of delegation can do that if it means that they're not having to deal with some of those other issues. And it's making decision-making more predictable and having fewer refusals against officer recommendation. And bringing it back to housing targets, you know, it's similar. If there is less room for debate around what the housing target is, you know, how many issues and options consultations do you see that have got, you know, 7 different housing targets in it that have each got to be thought up, explained, justified, given names, none of which are overly leading as to where it will go. And, you know, that's time that can be better spent doing other things and actually properly planning. Yeah. And thinking about what's the right location and what's the right form of development. They're the things that people become planners to deal with, not not to crunch numbers through formulas or fight appeals on somebody's dormer window having been refused.
Well, some of us do like a spreadsheet. So, you know, a small part of me does miss the OAN process, because you could have a multi-tabbed beautiful spreadsheet, but you know, I concede to the masses that maybe a standard method starting point is probably for
Join the affordable housing sphere. We have multiple ways of calculating housing.
Yeah. But
how's go on, Shelly.
So I was just the point I was going to make, and just sort of a cursory glance at the areas that are likely to be affected if the kind of affordability ratio is looked at in terms of upping the numbers where house pricing and affordability is a more acute issue, there seems to be a real direct correlation with places that suffer from a lot of holiday lets and second homes in those same areas as well. And that, is a real driving factor for affordability in particular areas. So it would be really interesting to see whether the standard method will, I suppose, take any account of the fact that those areas probably have sufficient housing stock, but it's not being used in, as primary residence. It's being used for holiday lets or second homes, and whether kind of any other policy interventions that aren't the standard method will sort of, I suppose, help shift the dial in some of those places, so they're not just building for a need that could be met within existing housing stock if it was used in a different form.
Yeah, a few Welsh councils have sort of tried to take the second homes element head on. I think one council were sort of, it needs to be your primary residence for council tax purposes, otherwise we're going to charge you a higher rate of council tax. Or there was another council which basically if it wasn't your primary residence, you had to either apply for a holiday let or a change of use, and everybody was up in arms. But it is that sort of element of, if Labour do really want to address the affordability problem and getting people the homes that they need. And I mean, Angela Rayner's quotes at the beginning of her speech were largely to do with 1.3 million people on housing registers, 150 children in temporary accommodation. There's empty homes where those people, empty, safe, well-built homes that those people could live in. But again, is that something for the NPPF? Is that something for planning, or is that more of a sort of government, this is what we're going to do kind of thing?
Yeah, let's take things out of planning rather than put more things into planning. If we want to do that through a council tax or other tax regime, let's do that. But just summing up our conversation, numbers, targets, that's all good. That all sounds really sensible. The key is the transition, isn't it?
Yeah.
Both in terms of the short-term planning applications and the longer term in terms of local, medium term in terms of local plan and strategic planning. But having that sensible approach has got to be, that's all about planning, isn't it? It's got to be sensible.
Hello viewers, Sam again. My thanks to Paul, Andrew, Shelley and Annie for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 7, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about LPA capacity, grey belt, new towns, devolution and greater than local planning, land value capture and planning for infrastructure and the environment. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. Please also feel free, viewers, to share this video on your social platforms. Anybody that does will be entitled to an exclusive 50 Shades mug. My thanks to podcast partners Kratos, and a shout out especially to Luca Di Fato for production support. What have we learnt, viewers? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of 50 Shades of Planning, which is brought to you in partnership with Kratos. Kratos are a leading communications consultancy providing integrated strategic communications and campaigns across multiple sectors. We have helped some of the UK's best-known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. We are more than an agency, we are change makers. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.